Welcome into another edition of Trent Talks, everybody. Our guest today, John F. Kennedy, who is running for Lieutenant Governor. And just the elephant in the room, you are not related to the Kennedys, the former President Kennedy, that family, correct?
Not related, Trent. If it is, it's somewhere way back up the food chain somewhere. And as I say to folks all the time, the President, JFK, he was part of the rich Northern Kennedys. I'm part of the poor Southern Kennedys. So different family group.
We just had to clear that up because as soon as people hear that, they're going to want to know. So I thought I would ask the probing questions. Let's talk about your run for Lieutenant Governor. For many people who follow politics know that you've represented a district that includes Macon, and you've done that for the past 11 years. You resigned from that position. You were Senate Pro Tem,
Yes.
highest ranking member of Georgia State Senate, so congratulations on that. But so I'm sure a lot of things went through your mind about making the leap to run for Lieutenant Governor with your family, talking about that and praying about that. But when the light went off in your head, why did you decide to run for Lieutenant Governor?
You know, first, Trent, thank you for having me on.
Sure.
Great being with you and your show, and I look forward to getting to visit and discuss some things with your listeners. You know, as you alluded to, I've been privileged to have some good responsibility in the Georgia Senate over 11 years, which have gone by real quickly. And the last 3 years serving as President Pro Tem, which meant that the President Pro Tem, as some folks probably know, presides over the Senate chamber whenever the Lieutenant Governor is not there. It basically does a lot of the other things the Lieutenant Governor does when he's or she is not there.
Correct.
And as well as administrative side of the Senate side of the Capitol, a lot of that falls under the Pro Tem's office. I say that to say that it's been a really good exercise and training ground for me, because it's forced me to think about issues in Georgia from a statewide basis versus just what's good for the 6 counties in middle Georgia that I represent. So I'm thankful that I've had that opportunity with a lot of encouragement to run statewide. And in thinking about, is this something that I should offer myself for and something that our family would do? Because it is a family decision. By the way, I'm married. Susan and I have been married 32 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And she's an incredible partner through all of this with me. And we have 2 near perfect children. Our daughter, Catherine, is a PA, and our son, Will, is a third year at Mercer Law School. He'll graduate here in a few months.
I know you're not proud at all.
I'm not proud at all. I'm incredibly blessed. And our daughter, who went to the University of Georgia, she went to Mercer's PA school. Yep, absolutely. So in making the decision that we would offer ourselves, it really was thinking about how incredibly important 2026 is for the state of Georgia. And what I mean by that is not just because my name's on the ballot. Politicians all say, wow, this is the most important year, right, when their name is on the ballot. But that's not what I'm talking about. All of our top constitutional officers in the state of Georgia are going to be new coming out of this 2026 election. Governor Kemp is termed out, right?
Right.
Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones is running for governor. The Secretary of State and the Attorney General are both running for governor. So come January of 2027, we're going to have there may be some familiar faces, but all new people in those spots. I don't know about you, but I think we've been very blessed to have had Governor Kemp as our governor for the last 7 years, and to have had his hands on the helm of this economy and guided us through COVID and the many other things that he has led us so well on. We've got to make sure that we continue many of those pro-business policies that Governor Kemp put in place, and followed also some great leadership from Governor Deal even before that.
Right.
So the answer to the question is, number one, it's because 2026 is really a pivotal year for us in Georgia. If we don't get the right people in those seats, in those offices, there's no reason we should assume that our tomorrow looks as good as what our yesterday has been. And so that, and for the many reasons I'm sure we'll get into of specifically what my vision is for the state of Georgia and the things that I want to make sure that we are attentive to. For example, number one, making sure that we keep Georgia growing, right? That we keep a good pro-business environment here in this state. You know, it's very competitive with our other southeastern states when we try to bring in business into the state of Georgia. And it's also very competitive for the businesses in Georgia when they choose to expand. Do they do that in Georgia, or do they do that in some other state? And if we keep the right business environment, then we can make sure that Georgians have good paying jobs, not just jobs, but good paying jobs where they can take care of their family, and that we can, at the Capitol, make sure that we continue to spend taxpayer dollars very wisely and as frugally as we possibly can. We owe that to the taxpayers of this state.
You talked about good paying jobs, and that is a great segue into my next question. We hear from people all the time, and you feel free to drink
Sure.
your water. I know we're asking you to talk a lot here, so feel free, and I will do the same. Who say they can't afford to live on many levels. They say, I remember growing up, and it was good enough if mom and dad had a job, we were able to make ends meet, and now they go to the grocery store and they say the prices are too high. And of course, I know gas prices are largely dependent on what's happening in the Middle East, and that can ebb and flow. But when you have a period when gases are higher, it just sort of compounds things. What would you say to those people who just they want to work hard, but they want wages to meet their needs? And I know you're trying to recruit industries that will provide that. But talk about your vision for that when people come up to you and say, Mr. Kennedy, I'm trying my best, but I just can't keep up with inflation.
That is an absolute, that's not just a fair criticism and a comment, that's an accurate comment of so many Georgians that are really struggling to make ends meet.
Right.
And it is a compounding of, number one, the inflation that we really all lived under for the 4 years of Joe Biden and his policies, and the difficulties that has visited on Georgians and continues to be a problem. That plus the other factors that you mentioned have continued to make it even more difficult. And yes, nationally, there appear to be some economic headwinds that
Sure.
we may be facing, and that also is creating some anxiety for folks. And that's one of the reasons that I am in favor of and have advocated for trying to have some meaningful change to some of our tax structures. Georgia's benefited from the pro-business environment, and we legislators in particular love to brag that we are, but all Georgians should take pride that for 12 years in a row we've been the #1 state in which to do business. And that's been very important in our ability to continue to attract business. And it's also been part of why our tax base has been positive in that we actually have excess reserves, right, beyond the rainy day fund that we have. We've got excess funds, and so we have, with Governor Kemp's leadership and also conservative leadership in the House and the Senate, we have returned some of those tax dollars for now 3 years back to taxpayers so that it goes back into their wallet, which, quite frankly, I happen to believe that even though it comes out of hardworking Georgians and goes to the Capitol, and goes to Atlanta, so to speak, it's still their money, and we owe it to every Georgian to make sure that we spend as wisely and only when necessary. And so that's part of it. But back to your point, you're absolutely right. Folks are suffering under trying to make sure that they can make ends meet. It's not just the inflation issue, it's the anxiety of worrying about the future. But in making sure that we keep a pro-business environment is one of the things, Trent, that I worked very hard on last year in working for, authoring, and sponsoring and passing the tort reform measures that Governor Kemp said in 2025 in his State of the State address were his #1 legislative priority. Now, why did he say that? He said that because everyone knows that insurance premiums were continuing to climb, that businesses were making decisions about whether or not they would not only expand, but whether or not they would maintain their businesses in Georgia. You've got small and even larger family-owned businesses that were concerned about, are they one lawsuit, one bad verdict away from losing maybe their entire family's business? All of that came together to the point where we had to do something. And so that's why I authored and sponsored the Senate Bill 68 and 69, which brought meaningful tort reform. And some folks say, well, John, what's a tort and what's tort reform?
Frivolous lawsuits?
Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. It's dealing with frivolous lawsuits. And that is, in addition to, as you mentioned, the inflation, that's one of the hidden taxes that all of us in Georgia pay. In fact, the Chamber of Commerce says that every Georgian is paying a little over $5,000 a year per family as a hidden tort tax, meaning the things that we have to pay extra for because of unnecessary and excessive verdicts. And so that is something that we all pay because at the end of the day, insurance companies pass cost on to
Always.
their policyholders.
Always
So
do,
when
yeah.
you see the big verdict, the $42 million verdict against CVS on something that they did not participate in, who do you think pays for that? Well, we all
Consumer,
do
yeah.
when we pay our insurance premiums. And so that's something that I work very hard for.
Well, let me ask you this: who should be making the decision on what is a frivolous lawsuit and what is a lawsuit where someone is trying to seek and gain justice? Because, as you know, so many things in life are subjective. So where do we draw the line? Who makes that decision? Because everyone's going to have an opinion. The person who thinks they're the victim, of course, they don't think it's frivolous at the time. You see my point?
Yeah, I completely see your point,
Yeah.
and I'm glad you asked, because it's also important for folks to realize that when the governor and I held our press conference, and as I presented the bills to the legislature, we made it very clear that nothing about tort reform is about denying someone who's been injured to full and fair compensation. Full and fair compensation.
Right.
And nothing about the bills deny that. What it did do, though, is try to simply readjust the scale so that everybody has a fair playing ground and goes into the court system on a equal footing. For example, when one of the things we've, Trent, already seen from this is, I think it was maybe 3 weeks ago now, is State Farm, one of the largest automobile insurers in the state of Georgia, announced a 10% reduction in their auto insurance policies across the board for the state of Georgia. Now, when is the last time you heard of that happening?
In my lifetime?
Yeah.
It's hard to remember.
Yeah, and it's being attributed to the tort reform, so that now, folks, we will have a civil justice system that works for everybody and is fair.
A big issue, and we talked about this before we started recording, data centers, not only here but throughout the state of Georgia, throughout the entire country. And people, they talk about the positives to it, and certainly Columbia County, where you are now, and Richmond County, they're talking about the possibility of one. Columbia County, they just approved 3. Aiken, they have the Facebook data center being built. So this is an issue that we have discussed on and on incessantly, and you hear from both sides. And in Columbia County, they're talking about the possibility of helping with property taxes, rolling back property taxes. Of course, we haven't got to that point to see if that's going to work. And then you hear from the side people worried about the zapping of water resources, or people worry that their electric bill is going to go up because of the amount of power that a data center needs. And so people, since this is something we've really never dealt with, they're trying to make sense of it.
Sure.
And where do you stand on the issue right now? Or are you, like a lot of people, you keep waiting for more information to come in? Because in many cases, people are talking about something that could happen, but they don't know until the data center is actually in place.
So some of those issues are developing, but there's a couple of positions that I have staked out, and I'm happy to share those with
Sure.
you. I think as a preliminary matter, there are 2 main concerns from an issue standpoint when it comes to data centers. And number one is the site selection and location of them.
Mm-hmm.
I personally think that needs to remain a local issue. Those decisions need to be made locally, and they need to be
By those who will be affected by it.
Exactly, by those who will be affected.
Yeah.
And depending upon where you are in the state, that may be a county commissioner type decision.
And
or
that's the way it
commission.
happened, here in Columbia County and happening in Richmond County.
Yeah,
So.
and in some areas it may be a planning and zoning committee, and
Right.
sometimes it's both.
Right.
And so I think that those decisions need to be made locally, so that when people have concerns about where is this going to be located, and is it going to be located close to me, I want to be heard. I think that process has to go forward like we have it. The other issue that I do have definite opinions about, and you touched on it, and it is the additional cost for the provision of the electricity for these data centers and the infrastructure necessary when you bring these to an area of the state. There may be a few locations where much of the infrastructure is there, but that's not what we're seeing, because you've got rural areas of the state that have really been trying to solicit and get data centers, right? And so I would tell you that the additional cost, whether it's for the infrastructure that will be to get the electricity back out onto the grid, or any other cost of the actually providing the energy, if we have additional load that we are not prepared for in the state, the data centers need to pay for that additional cost. That should not be borne by the rest of Georgia in our power bill that we have for our house or the power bill that we get at our business. And so I'm very firm in my belief about that. I think that's fair, and it's really no different than most developers if you think about it. If someone comes in with a subdivision,
Right.
typically the bidder will come in and they'll pay for the roads and they'll pay for the power,
Right.
water and sewer, and then that is baked into what? Into the cost of the people that come in and move into that area. So I don't think it's a novel theory or feeling of what is really fair, and so I think people are rightfully concerned about what is this going to do to the cost of the electric bill that I'm going to see in the future. And that additional cost to either have the capacity or the infrastructure needs to be borne by the data centers.
Looking down the line, is there anything lawmakers could do if there was a scenario where after the data center is in place and there is evidence that electricity rates are skyrocketing even though we're trying to keep them in line, or water resources, all of a sudden water pressure is gone, or people they can't use the water like they have been in the past? Is there anything that lawmakers could do after the fact, or is that more state environmental decisions? How does that work?
Well, I think it's a combination. I really see that sort of on three fronts.
Yeah.
Number one, it would be primarily, this is, as you know, governed by the Public Service Commission, the provision of energy and what our long-term policy is on what are going to be the load needs for the state.
Right.
How are we going to provide for that? And when you've got Georgia Power and the EMCs being the two main providers of electricity, at least for the Georgia Power part, they're subject to the Public Service Commission. So their involvement is already there for oversight purposes. Second, as to environmental issues and those concerns, absolutely. If there are concerns, those need to be lodged with EPD so that they're involved as well. And then third, to answer your question, I think that the legislature also should always be looking at our businesses and for our citizens and making sure that the environment that we projected and thought would be would materialize when it comes to bringing new businesses into the state. We need to look and see, did that happen? And that's when you're examining the assumptions about when it came and also how it stays. And if, in fact, to your point, that this turns out to be not what folks expected or
were promised.
or promised,
Yeah.
then yes, the legislature can act.
Okay. Now, if you are duly elected, and I'm sure you're optimistic about that, is there any one thing that you would love to see happen to get enacted while you're in office? Do you have a pet project, a passion that burns deeply within you? I know you're juggling 8 balls when you're in office, but is there a real burning passion in you for any particular issue?
There is, and if we have time, I'll give you two quick ones. I think number one is something that I worked on last year, and it came from me learning about something that I think is a hidden crisis in our public school systems, and it's called chronic absenteeism, which is defined as kids that are missing more than 10% of their school year. And that's 18 days a year here in Georgia. It is a lot. Yeah. And pre-COVID, our chronic absenteeism rate was 9.5%. As you would have expected, it spiked during COVID, got as high as 26%. Trent, it's still at 21%. That number represents 360,000 school kids, our kids here in Georgia, that are missing more than 18 days a year. Do you think they have the chance for the American dream and the Georgia dream we want for them? They don't.
Also, for Georgia to be a leading state, it affects that.
Exactly. We've got to have our kids ready for their tomorrow, because quite frankly, their tomorrow and kids graduating high school today, their tomorrow is more complex and more challenging than it was for me when I graduated high school. I think it was a simpler time. And so we've got to make sure that the kids are ready for that. But we've got to address this. I've authored, after a lot of research, something called, it was Senate Bill 123. We passed it out of the Senate, out of the House, and it calls for the local school systems to identify the causes of of chronic absenteeism, and to also fashion remedies and solutions for it. And then what I also said was, but this is not a silver bullet for this problem. So I formed a study committee, and we went last year around the state, and we held public forums to invite people to come talk about chronic absenteeism in those school systems that are managing it well and those that are not, and the experts in helping us figure out how to address this. It's something I'm passionate about. You know, I'm not an educator. I've never been a superintendent or a principal. I'm just a lawyer. But I do know that if the kids are not in the seats and they're missing more than 18 days of their school year, their future is not what we want it to be. If I could tell you quickly about the other thing
Absolutely.
that I'm
Go
passionate
ahead.
about, and it deals with the mental health crisis that we have in Georgia in the uninsured population, and specifically you see it a lot with homelessness and other issues. The short version is we have not done what we need to do in this state to deal with the mental health population, especially the uninsured population. We made some improvements about 3 years ago with the passage of House Bill 1013. But a long time ago, we had institutions that dealt with it that were closed down because of a product of federal litigation and many other things. And while those were not perfect, they at least provided some resource. Then other different models were followed that really have not done what they need to do.
Right.
Trent, it is the number one thing I hear from my sheriffs that I have represented, and that is they say, you know, John, we are not equipped, resourced, or trained to deal with the mental health population, but what happens when someone who is acting in a way that people feel fearful of, they call the sheriff, and the deputy has to get them, and he only has one place to take them.
But is it fair for deputies, as hard as their job is now, to also be mental health counselors in a volatile situation? It's great for them to be further trained, but it just seems unfair to ask them to do one more thing.
It's absolutely not, and that's my point. And
Yeah.
that's why I'm saying the sheriffs and the deputies are saying we're not equipped for this. And it's where we have not done right by the sheriffs, right? Because they are the resource of last result for someone.
Sure.
Number two, it's not been fair to folks that are being incarcerated because we don't have anywhere else to put them. And then, Trent, while they're there, they're not getting any mental health services, so they're not getting better. And it's not been right for the state of Georgia. So it's one of those things. There have been some efforts this year for the provision of budgets to have a mental health hospital in our future. That's going to take a while to build. I think, quite frankly, it's not enough. We need to do more. But it's something I'm passionate about because it's a serious issue for the state.
Has it been hard to gain traction in the Georgia House and Senate to get funding for something like this? I mean, you've got this pie and you've got to slice it up so many different ways, and everybody has a certain interest and passion. Has it been tough to do that?
You know, it has, but I will tell you, starting literally about 4 years ago, when the former speaker, 4 or 5 years ago, when former Speaker David Ralston wrote a bill that required the provision of mental health services pursuant to insurance contracts, that really took a fresh look at those that need those services and how does the state or through insurance contracts, how are those provided? That was a catalyst to help us think about, wait a minute, we need to be thoughtful and we need to be compassionate. And then I think that has produced where we are now of having discussions about how about the rest of these populations that are not insured. So I would tell you it's not been as quick as I would want, but it is a growing awareness of the problem. And with that comes, I think, a growing acceptance that, yes, we're going to have to devote the resources to get this fixed.
John F. Kennedy, current candidate for Georgia's Lieutenant Governor, thank you so much for your time. I know you have some other stops here in the area and then heading on to Atlanta. It's a whirlwind for you, so we do appreciate it.
Thank you, Trent. It's been great to be with you. I've enjoyed being in Augusta.
Yeah, well, good to have you.
Great, thanks.